A poor mechanic rescues a woman and a child on the highway in the middle of a snowstorm and takes them to his home. The next day, he becomes a millionaire. The smell of burnt oil and grease clung to every inch of Jack's faded blue coveralls, an aroma as familiar to him as his own name. His rough hands, marked by decades of handling metal and engines, moved through a ritual as old as his memory itself, wiping each tool meticulously one by one, with the same keen attention he gave to every car that passed through his shop. Jack's Auto Repair, as the worn-out sign on the facade declared, had occupied the same address in Ridgemont for 25 years. The brick building, with its large metal doors and windows clouded by time, had witnessed more than just mechanical repairs. It had seen an entire life dedicated to keeping people on the move. Jack knew every crack in the walls, every stain on the concrete floor, every peculiar sound the place made when the wind blew strong, just like it was doing now. Winter had arrived early that year, bringing a cold that felt like it could freeze even one's memories. Through the shop's windows, now stained by years of soot, Jack could see the first snowflakes dancing under the yellowish glow of the street lamps. The old clock on the wall, a relic his father had installed on opening day, read 7:43 p.m. In earlier times, the shop would still be bustling with a line of cars waiting their turn. Now the only sounds other than the wind were the steady ticking of the clock and the uneven hum of the space heater in the corner. "At least it still works," he muttered to himself, casting a grateful glance at the old heater. It was one of the few things in the shop that still worked properly, along with the toolbox inherited from his father and his stubborn determination to keep the business running against all odds. Jack ran his hand through his gray hair, letting out a sigh that formed a tiny cloud in the frigid air. His eyes, which had witnessed thousands of engines come back to life under his care, drifted toward the makeshift desk serving as his office. A pile of bills stacked there like a card tower on the verge of collapse. 3 notices from the bank, an overdue electricity bill, and a final warning from his parts supplier. The red final notice stamp seemed to taunt him under the flickering fluorescent light, which, as if tired of struggling, blinked sporadically. The town was changing, and not necessarily for the better, at least not for small business owners like him. Big franchise auto repair chains had been opening up one after another, with shiny storefronts, modern equipment, and tempting promotions promising computerized diagnostics and extended warranties. Their gleaming facilities made Jack's shop look like a relic from a forgotten time, a dinosaur fighting for survival in the digital age. The computer in the corner, his only significant concession to modernity, bought second-hand 3 years ago after much insistence from his nephew, displayed numbers that told no lies. The spreadsheets that Mark, his nephew, had taught him to use revealed a cruel truth. In 6 months, maybe less, he'd have to shut down if something didn't change drastically. "Tomorrow will be better," he mumbled, repeating his usual phrase, though it grew harder to believe every day. It was something his father often said, even in the hardest times, even when customers were scarce and bills piled high. Jack stowed the last of his tools in the metal cabinet, each in its designated place, a habit he'd kept since first learning the trade. Old Peter always said a well-organized shop was the reflection of a competent mechanic. The memory of his father brought a melancholy smile to his lips. Peter had built this shop from scratch, turning an abandoned warehouse into one of the most reputable establishments in the area. Back then, Ridgemont was still a place where people knew each other by name, where a handshake meant more than a contract, and where a man's word was his greatest bond. Jack could still vividly recall the day his father handed him the shop keys just before retiring. Peter's fingers, as calloused then as Jack's were now, trembled slightly as he held the key ring. "Take good care of her, son," were his words. "It's not just a shop, it's where we help people continue their journey." Peter passed away 2 years later, but Jack always felt his presence there, in the tools he still used, the advice he followed, and the way he treated every customer as though they were family. The wind outside picked up, causing the old windows to rattle in their frames. Jack put on his worn-out jacket, a gift from a distant Christmas when he was still married. The threadbare fabric still held a bit of Catherine's scent, or maybe it was just his imagination. She had left 5 years ago, weary of the constant financial worries and the never-ending routine. "You love that shop more than you love me," were her last words before she left for Bayfield, with an insurance salesman who promised stability and comfort. Jack never blamed her. Perhaps she was right. The shop had been his entire life, his first and last thought each day. How many birthday evenings had he missed because of a client's emergency? How many weekends had he sacrificed to finish urgent jobs? How many plans had been postponed because all extra money had to be reinvested in the business? The snow was falling more heavily by the time he finally locked up. The sky was fully dark, turning the town into a maze of shadows dotted with the yellow glow of street lamps. Instead of heading straight home, as he usually did, something compelled him to take a drive around town. Maybe it was the loneliness, which felt heavier on nights like this, or maybe it was a hunch he couldn't yet name, his old Ford Escort, which he kept running more out of stubbornness than practicality. Protested when he turned the ignition key. The engine coughed twice before firing up, sending familiar vibrations through the worn-out steering wheel. Jack knew every sound and every shudder of that car as well as his own breathing. It was more than transportation. It was a silent companion on his solitary journeys. The heater took a few minutes to start working. Enough time for the cold to seep in through every gap of the car. Jack adjusted the rear-view mirror, noticing the new wrinkles forming around his eyes. When had he aged so much? It felt like only yesterday he was that eager young mechanic, receiving the shop keys from his father. The streets were nearly deserted at that hour, transformed into white corridors by the relentless snowfall. The Escort's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing a town that appeared almost unrecognizable under the winter's blanket. Jack drove slowly, his thoughts drifting between memories of the past and the looming worries about his uncertain future. He passed the old textile factory, now abandoned, its broken windows like empty eyes staring at the night. How many times had he repaired the trucks that came and went from there, loaded with fabrics shipped all over the country? He recalled the din of machines, the coming and going of workers, the smell of cotton in the air. Now, only pigeons and stray cats roamed its ruins, and silence was broken only by the wind howling through the peeling walls. The town was filled with places like that, businesses that had shut down, dreams that had died, lives that had moved on elsewhere. Old Renee's gas station, where Jack used to grab coffee on Sunday mornings, now had a "sold" sign hanging on its rusty gate. Another family-run enterprise swallowed up by modern self-service stations, where you could fill up without speaking to a soul. The radio crackled, picking up only fragments of distant music and chatter. Even so, Jack left it on. Noise was better than total silence, better than the thoughts that haunted him on nights like these. The snowfall intensified, forming a white curtain that reduced visibility. He really should have gone home, but something kept him on the road, a restlessness he couldn't explain. That was when his headlights caught something unusual on the sidewalk. At first, it looked just like a denser shadow among the trees that lined the street. But as he approached, the shape took more defined contours. Jack slowed down, his heart inexplicably picking up pace. Two figures stood out against the darkness, one adult-sized and the other smaller, clearly a woman and a child. They were partially shielded by an umbrella that looked ready to be destroyed by the wind. Two small suitcases rested beside them, completing the surreal scene. Snow fell mercilessly on them, turning their outlines almost ethereal under the dim streetlights. Jack drove past slowly, watching through the rearview mirror. The snow was falling even harder now, and the temperature kept dropping. The car's display read -3 degrees Celsius. His tiny apartment awaited him, with its inconsistent heater and familiar loneliness. It would have been safer to just keep going, to ignore the scene, as so many other drivers likely had that night. Yet something about that sight moved him profoundly. Perhaps the evident vulnerability of those two figures, or perhaps because he himself knew only too well the weight of loneliness. He braked gently, watching his taillights reflect on the falling snow. "God help me," he murmured, shifting into reverse. The Escort backed up slowly, its red taillights coloring the snowflakes. The two figures remained motionless, as if frozen in time. Jack parked beside the curb, his heart beating against his ribs. In his 50-something years of life, he had helped dozens of people with car troubles on deserted roads. But this was different. "Do you need help?" he asked through the lowered window, trying to keep his voice as gentle as possible. The woman raised her face, and Jack could see her delicate features more clearly now, though they were marked by evident fatigue. Her green eyes, when they met his, showed a complex mix of caution, despair, and something else, something he couldn't quite decipher. Her dark hair, sprinkled with snow, framed a face that under different circumstances would be jovial, but now looked weighed down by worry. We're just waiting for someone," she replied, her accent suggesting she might be from another region. The little girl at her side, who couldn't have been older than 4, clung more tightly to her mother's legs. Golden curls escaped from a faded pink beanie, and her wide blue eyes studied Jack with a mix of fear and curiosity. Jack noticed the 2 worn suitcases beside them and how both were shivering in the cold. The umbrella barely shielded them, its ribs broken in places and the fabric torn. "In this weather, it's not safe to stay out here." The little girl coughed, a small yet worrisome sound that echoed in the deserted street. The woman held her closer, whispering soothing words that got lost in the wind. Her red, cold hands gingerly adjusted the child's scarf. "My name is Jack," he introduced himself, turning off the engine. The sudden silence made the wind and falling snow sound louder. "I'm a mechanic. My shop is a few blocks from here. I can show you my ID if you'd like." The woman's hesitation was palpable, and Jack didn't blame her. Times were such that distrust was a survival tactic. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the fear of trusting a stranger battling with the desperate need for help. "Elise," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And this is Sophie." Sophie looked up at Jack, her big blue eyes like a summer sky, a stark contrast to the freezing night around them. A snowflake landed on her small nose, making her blink in surprise. For a brief moment, just a moment, Jack glimpsed the carefree child she should have been under normal circumstances, happy, unworried, full of life. Elise nodded, biting her lip. "We'll be all right," she insisted, but her voice shook as much as her body. Her eyes constantly scanned the street, as if seeking something or someone in the shadows cast by the street lamps. Jack glanced at the sky, where the snow fell ever more densely. The flakes danced under the lamplight, creating a white curtain that isolated this small section of sidewalk from the rest of the world. He thought of his modest apartment, of the temperamental heater, of the loneliness awaiting him. He thought of his own daughter, Marie, whom he hadn't seen in years, and how he'd want someone to help her if she were in a similar situation. "I live nearby," he said, surprising even himself with the decision he was making. "It's not much, but I have a sofa bed and heating. You could—" He stopped, realizing how that might sound to a woman alone with a child on a night like this. Elise studied his face for a long moment, and Jack stood still, letting her see nothing but the truth. A middle-aged man, tired and worried, offering help in the only way he could. The wrinkles around his eyes, his calloused hands visible on the steering wheel, the worn work coveralls beneath his jacket, all of it told a story of a simple, honest life. A stronger gust of wind swept the street, causing Sophie to shiver violently. The umbrella finally gave in, one of its ribs snapping with a crack that seemed to echo in the night. That moment, more than anything else, seemed to make up Elise's mind. "Are you sure we won't be a burden?" Her voice carried a mix of hope and apprehension, as though each word was carefully weighed before being spoken. "No burden at all," Jack assured, getting out of the car to grab their suitcases. "Besides, my conscience wouldn't let me sleep knowing you two were out here in this weather." The suitcases were surprisingly light when he lifted them, as if they'd been hastily packed with only the bare essentials. He also noticed they were of high quality, expensive luggage, albeit showing signs of recent heavy use. Another detail that didn't quite fit the puzzle of who Elise and Sophie might be. The walk to his apartment was quiet, broken only by their footsteps in the freshly fallen snow and Sophie's occasional heavy breathing, suggesting she was fighting both cold and exhaustion. Jack led them through alleys less exposed to the wind, carefully choosing the most sheltered route. At every corner, he noticed how Elise looked over her shoulder, her green eyes scanning the shadows with an intensity that spoke of deep, genuine fear. His building was one of the oldest on the street, its facade telling decades of neglect in its cracks and water stains. The entrance door groaned as Jack unlocked it with a rusty key. The dimly lit lobby, illuminated by a single flickering fluorescent bulb, smelled of mildew and cheap cleaning supplies. "It's on the 3rd floor," he explained, starting up the stairs. The weak light cast strange shadows on the peeling walls. "The elevator's been out of service for months." "I'm sorry." Elise murmured that it was fine, but Jack could hear her breathing get heavier with each step. Sophie, still clinging to her mother's hand, dragged her small feet on each stair, clearly exhausted. Her face was red from the cold, and her occasional cough echoed up the empty stairwell. On the 3rd floor, Jack stopped in front of apartment 302, one of 4 doors opening onto a narrow corridor. The metal numbers were askew, and the paint was peeling at the corners. But the lock was new, one of the few splurges he'd allowed himself in recent years, after a spate of break-ins in the neighborhood made him reconsider his security. "This is it," he announced, opening the door. It was dark inside, but he could feel Elise's assessing gaze taking in the surroundings as he fumbled for the light switch. "It's not much, but it's warm." The light revealed a small living room, clean though sparsely furnished. A well-worn but well-kept sofa bed took up the main wall, flanked by an old armchair that had once belonged to his father, one of the few pieces Jack kept after Catherine left. A modest TV sat on a makeshift stand made from wooden crates he had salvaged from the shop and sanded down. On the wall, several black and white photographs depicted classic cars and a younger Jack working on them. They were more than mere decor. They were milestones of his life, moments captured on paper that told the story of his shop, his craft, and who he was. One of the photos, yellowed with time, showed his father on opening day, his proud smile forever frozen in that moment of hope and promise. "We don't want to trouble you," Elise began, but her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl, causing Sophie to giggle. The first truly childlike sound Jack had heard from her. Jack smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest at that small spark of normalcy. "It's no trouble at all, Sophie. Do you like vegetable soup?" Sophie nodded shyly, still not letting go of her mother's hand, though her eyes followed Jack's movements with evident curiosity. He noticed she was clutching a small cloth doll to her chest, worn from frequent play, its embroidered features nearly faded away. Soon, the apartment was filled with the comforting aroma of soup simmering on the stove, a simple recipe his mother had taught him years ago when he was learning to live on his own after his father's passing. The ingredients were basic: vegetables, a bit of meat, common seasonings, but there was something about the preparation that always brought solace, as though each spoonful carried a bit of the maternal love he had so long been without. While the soup warmed, Jack prepared the sofa bed with clean sheets that smelled of fabric softener and set aside extra blankets he kept for colder nights. He also found an old t-shirt that could serve as a nightgown for Sophie. It was simple but clean and soft from wear. For a moment, he held it in his hands, recalling his own daughter wearing something similar on nights like this, so long ago. Marie would be almost 20 now. The last time he'd seen her was on her 15th birthday, a brief and uncomfortable visit at a coffee shop in Bayfield. Catherine was there too, of course, with her new husband, the insurance salesman who promised her a life Jack could never provide. Marie barely looked him in the eye that day, answering his questions with polite but distant monosyllables. Since then, their contact had been limited to holiday cards and the occasional text message on special dates. The soup's bubbling brought him back to the present. He served 3 bowls, placing them on his small kitchen table along with some bread, which, though not fresh, was still good when warmed. Steam rose from the bowls, fogging the window that faced a street now completely white with snow. "This is delicious," Elise commented after her first spoonful, her cheeks regaining a bit of color from the warmth of the meal. Her hands still shook slightly as she held the spoon, but her eyes had lost some of that constant tension he'd seen when he found them. Sophie ate hungrily, as though she hadn't had a hot meal in days. Between spoonfuls, she cast curious glances at Jack, who pretended not to notice, giving her space to feel more at ease. There was something in her gestures that reminded him of Marie at that age, the same way of blowing on hot soup, the same way of wiping her mouth with the back of her hand when she thought no one was looking. "We're heading to Waverley," Elise suddenly said, as though feeling the need to explain. Her voice tried to sound casual, but there was an underlying tension Jack didn't fail to notice. "We had an issue with our connection." Jack nodded without pressing her for details. Something in the way she said issue suggested a far more complex, perhaps painful story. Years of fixing cars had taught him that sometimes people needed quiet understanding more than well-intentioned questions. How many times had he heard similar accounts in his shop? People with problems, just trying to move on, leaving behind lives that had shattered like engines beyond repair. They finished the meal in comfortable silence, broken only by the clink of spoons and Sophie's occasional yawns, which were becoming more frequent. Her blue eyes were closing for longer stretches, her head tipping slightly to one side before she forced herself upright again. Elise noticed her daughter's fatigue and quickly finished her own meal. "Let's get you ready for bed, sweetie," she said softly, using a truly maternal tone for the first time since Jack had met them. Jack watched as Elise helped Sophie into the borrowed t-shirt, which reached the girl's knees like an improvised dress. The child could barely keep her eyes open during the process, mumbling something incoherent about her doll, which she still clutched tightly. Within minutes, Sophie was sound asleep on the sofa bed, her soft, steady breathing filling the living room with a calming rhythm that somehow made the apartment feel less lonely. Elise gently tucked the blankets around her daughter, fingers lingering on the golden curls spread across the pillow. "Would you like some tea?" Jack asked quietly, not wanting to disturb the sleeping child. Elise hesitated before nodding, following him into the small kitchen. The silence between them as Jack prepared the tea was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence shared by two people who, though strangers, understood the fragility of life and the importance of small acts of kindness. "Thank you," she finally said, wrapping her hands around the steaming mug as though seeking not just its warmth, but also some kind of grounding in reality. Not just for the food and shelter, but for not asking questions. Jack watched the steam rise from his own mug, thinking of all the stories he'd heard in his shop, of the people who came looking for more than just a car repair. "Sometimes," he replied softly, "the most important kindness is knowing when not to ask." Through the kitchen window, they could see the snow still falling, now more gently, as though the night was calming down. The street lamps cast yellow circles in the whiteness outside, and occasionally a car passed slowly, its headlights cutting through the darkness like luminous blades. The kitchen clock read nearly midnight when Jack finally headed to his bedroom, leaving Elise to settle on the sofa bed beside her sleeping daughter. The apartment had plunged into a deep hush, broken only by the occasional creak of old pipes and the distant howling of the wind. Lying in bed, Jack considered how life could change in a matter of hours. That morning, he'd been just a lonely mechanic struggling to keep his shop open. Now, by some twist of fate, his apartment was home to two strangers carrying mysteries he couldn't even guess. Then he heard it. A low murmur from the living room, so soft he first thought it was the wind. But soon he recognized Elise's voice, speaking urgently into a phone, doing her best to remain calm. "No, he hasn't found us. We're safe. For now." A pause. "Yes, I managed to take enough before. No, I can't say where we are." Another, longer pause. "I know it's risky, but we had no choice. Sophie is exhausted. We couldn't keep going." Jack tried not to listen further, turning in bed and covering his head with the pillow. That conversation wasn't meant for his ears, and the less he knew, the better. Still, the few words he overheard painted a disturbing picture. Who was he? What were they fleeing from? The rest of the night passed slowly. Jack slept fitfully, waking multiple times to noises real or imagined. In his moments of wakefulness, he thought of his own daughter, of how unpredictable life could be, and sometimes cruel. What could have happened to force Elise to flee on a winter's night with a small child? Dawn arrived with a surprisingly clear sky. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving Ridgemont blanketed in pristine white. Jack awoke to the sound of movement in the kitchen, soft footsteps, the clink of cups, quiet voices. When he emerged from his bedroom, he found Elise and Sophie already dressed and ready, their small suitcases by the door. The kitchen was spotless, the sofa bed tidied as though no one had slept there. "We need to go," Elise said the moment she saw him, her tone kind but decisive. "We've already taken too much of your kindness." Sophie, more awake now and less shy than the previous night, ran over to hug his legs. "Thank you for dinner, Uncle Jack," she said in her little voice, making his heart clench. "You don't have to rush," Jack replied, noticing they had washed not just the breakfast dishes, but also the pans from the previous night. "I could drive you to the bus station if you want." "You're very kind," Elise interjected, holding her daughter's hand, "but we've already called a taxi. It's better this way." Her eyes avoided his, as though she was afraid he might read in them secrets that had to remain hidden. Jack noticed her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted Sophie's coat. There was something in her manner that suggested urgency, a need to leave before what? "At least take this," he insisted, taking a few bills from his wallet. It wasn't much. He himself was struggling, but he couldn't let them go empty-handed. "No, please," Elise refused firmly, looking him in the eye at last. "You've already done more than enough." She hesitated, as though weighing her next words carefully. "There are still good people in this world, Jack. You're one of them." A car horn sounded from below. The taxi had arrived. Elise grabbed the suitcases with a practiced swiftness, while Sophie clutched her inseparable doll. In minutes they were heading down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. Jack followed them to the building's entrance, watching as they climbed into the taxi. Through the car window, Sophie waved, her small face lit by a smile that, for a moment, dispelled all the shadows of the previous night. Elise simply nodded, her green eyes meeting his one last time, a look conveying more gratitude than words could express. The taxi drove away, disappearing around the corner and carrying away its mysterious passengers. The previous night's snow was already beginning to melt under the morning sun, trickling into the gutters. The town was waking up slowly, resuming its routine as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But something extraordinary had happened, Jack thought, as he climbed back to his apartment. On an ordinary winter night, for just a brief moment, his lonely life had become intertwined with the lives of two fugitives, from what or whom he'd likely never know. Entering his home, he spotted something on the kitchen table, a drawing made by Sophie on a piece of paper. It showed a simple house with three smiling figures in front, one tall, presumably him, and two smaller, clearly Elise and Sophie. In the corner, in carefully traced childish letters, it read, "For Uncle Jack with love." Jack picked up the drawing with care, a bittersweet smile on his lips. As he pinned it to the refrigerator with a magnet, his eyes fell on the clock. In 2 hours, he'd have to open the shop, face another day of financial worries and uncertainty. But something had changed. The loneliness that once felt suffocating was now softened by a new perspective. His own struggles felt smaller compared to the mysteries and fears Elise and Sophie carried. The sound of a slowly passing car outside drew his attention. It was a dark vehicle with tinted windows, different from the taxi that had taken his guests. The driver slowed down as he passed the building, and for a moment Jack felt a chill race down his spine. Watching the car disappear into the distance, Jack couldn't imagine that the cold winter night was merely the beginning, that his act of kindness, seemingly simple and isolated, was actually the first chapter of a far larger story. Our story that would show him that sometimes angels don't come with wings and halos, but with battered suitcases and frightened eyes, seeking shelter from both literal and metaphorical storms. The clock continued its steady ticking, marking the start of a new day. But for Jack, it was more than that. It was the start of something new, even if he couldn't yet say what. Holding Sophie's drawing like a talisman of hope, he prepared to face another day at the shop, carrying with him the mystery of that winter night and the certainty that sometimes the greatest gifts arrive disguised as chance encounters in a snowstorm. The shop felt quieter than usual that afternoon. Sophie's drawing, which Jack had brought from home and discreetly pinned to a corner of his desk, was the only bright spot among the neatly lined-up tools and the stack of overdue bills. 3 days had passed since he'd sheltered Elise and her daughter, but their memory was still as vivid as the aroma of soup in his apartment. "Final notice," he muttered, running his calloused fingers over the red stamp that marked yet another unpaid bill. The bank had called that morning, the manager's voice teetering between rehearsed sympathy and professional firmness. The numbers didn't lie. In a matter of weeks, maybe days, he would have to make a final decision about the shop's future. The last customer of the day had left half an hour ago, leaving behind payment for a minor repair that barely covered the cost of parts. Jack gazed at the crumpled bill in his hand, wondering how much longer he could keep the doors open and continue the legacy his father had built with so much sweat. The door buzzer jolted him from his thoughts. For a brief, absurd moment, his heart sped up thinking of Elise and Sophie. But the figure who entered couldn't have been more different. A tall man, impeccably dressed in a grey suit that likely cost more than all the shop equipment combined. "Mr. Jack Morris?" the man asked, his polite tone carrying the refined accent of a big city. He held an Italian leather briefcase, completing the image of sophistication that seemed out of place amid grease and tools. "Yes," Jack replied, automatically wiping his hands on the rag he always kept in his coverall pocket. A smudge of oil on his cheek made him abruptly aware of his own appearance. "Philip Lamarck, from Lamarck & Associates in New York," the man introduced himself, offering a business card as elegant as his attire. "I'm here on a matter of utmost importance to discuss with you." Jack indicated the only free chair in the small administrative area, quickly clearing some invoices from the makeshift desk. Lamarck sat with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to far more refined settings. "Mr. Morris, I'm here as the legal representative of a client who wishes to remain anonymous," he began, opening his briefcase and pulling out some documents. "This client has expressed the desire to make a substantial donation to your establishment." Jack blinked, certain he'd misheard. "A donation?" "Precisely." Lamarck adjusted his gold-framed glasses. "The amount in question is $2 million. The silence that followed was so dense Jack could hear the ticking of the same old clock his father had installed decades ago. His mind tried to grasp the number delivered so casually. "You must be mistaken," he finally managed. "Why would anyone—" "There's no mistake, Mr. Morris," Lamarck interrupted gently, sliding a document across the desk. "All the paperwork is in order. The transfer can be made as soon as you sign the necessary forms." Jack picked up the document with trembling hands. The words seemed to dance before his eyes. Legal terms, clauses, numbers that felt unreal. His gaze drifted to Sophie's drawing, and for a fleeting moment, a suspicion crossed his mind. The donor truly wants to remain anonymous. "That is non-negotiable," Lamarck replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. The client was very clear about it. Jack returned his attention to the papers. Among the legal terms and mind-boggling figures, one line caught his eye. "In recognition of selfless acts of kindness and the preservation of fundamental human values." "Why me?" The question escaped before he could hold it back. Lamarck allowed himself a small smile. "My client believes there are people who deserve a second chance. People who keep alive certain values that our modern society seems to have forgotten." The lawyer pulled a Mont Blanc pen from his inside jacket pocket, offering it to Jack. "The choice is, of course, yours. But let me note that opportunities like this rarely present themselves twice in a lifetime." Jack looked around the shop, the neatly organized tools his father had taught him to respect, the oil stains on the floor that told stories of countless repairs, the photos on the walls documenting a life dedicated to helping people keep going. He thought of Elise and Sophie, of how a simple act of kindness could create ripples far beyond his understanding. With a clarity that surprised him, he realized it didn't really matter who was behind the donation. What mattered was what he would do with it. "Where do I sign?" he asked, taking the pen. Lamarck expertly guided him through the process, pointing out where to sign with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with important documents. When they finished, the lawyer placed the papers back into his briefcase as carefully as a jeweler handling precious stones. "The funds will be available in your account within 48 hours, he informed Jack, standing up. "My office will be in touch to assist with any administrative or tax-related questions." Before leaving, Lamarck paused at the door, giving Jack one last look. "You know, Mr. Morris, in my line of work, it's rare to be part of something genuinely good. This is one of those rare moments." The echo of the closing door reverberated in the empty shop. Jack remained seated, staring at the business card in his hand and Sophie's drawing on the desk. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows through the dusty windows, turning the shop into a kaleidoscope of light and shade. Somewhere in town, he thought. Maybe Elise and Sophie were safe now, moving forward with their lives. He'd never be certain if there was a connection between that snowy night and what had just happened, and perhaps that was for the best. The old clock kept ticking steadily, the same sound that had accompanied his days since childhood. But for the first time in a long while, that sound no longer carried the weight of worry. Instead, it seemed to mark the beginning of something new, something far beyond simply saving a shop. Jack stood up slowly, walked to the wall where his father's photo smiled in black and white. "You always said helping people keep going was more important than just fixing cars," he murmured to the image. "I think I finally understand what you meant, Dad." With a deep breath, he returned to his desk and began doing something he hadn't done in a long time, planning for the future. Ideas took shape in his mind about how to use that unexpected gift, not just to save the shop, but to transform it into something more, something his father would be proud to see. Sophie's drawing remained quietly in the corner of the desk, its smiling figures bearing witness to the moment a lonely mechanic's life changed forever. The shop's clock read 8:47 p.m. when Jack finally placed the documents left by Philip Lamarck into his own battered leather briefcase. His hands, calloused from decades of mechanical work, trembled slightly as he closed the metal latch. $2 million. The number waltzed through his mind, impossible to fully process. The shop, usually so familiar, felt different that night. The shadows cast by the hanging tools danced strangely under the flickering fluorescent lights. The smell of oil and metal, normally a comforting perfume to Jack, felt almost overpowering, or maybe his senses were heightened by the shock of the news. The lawyer's business card weighed in his pocket like lead, though it was only paper. Jack pulled it out again, running his fingers over the embossed letters, Philip Lamarck, Lamarck and Associates. The New York address, in elegant script, might as well have belonged to another universe, one of luxury offices and life-changing decisions, so far removed from his reality of wrenches and broken engines. By the time he stepped outside, night had fully descended on Ridgemont. The early spring wind carried the last vestiges of winter, making him pull his worn-out jacket closer. His old Ford Escort waited in the usual spot, its faded paint reflecting the streetlights with a melancholy gleam. The car protested as usual upon ignition, the engine coughing twice before catching. Jack smiled inwardly. Despite all the promised wealth, his longtime companion remained the same. Perhaps that was a sign, he thought, that some things should never change, no matter how large a bank account might grow. The drive home had never felt so long. Each red light was a chance for his mind to wander, to question the reality of what had happened. The familiar streets of Ridgemont slid by like a slow-motion film, each familiar storefront now seeming different in the glow of his changed circumstances. He passed Moreau's bakery, where he bought his bread every morning. Would he still do that now that he was a millionaire? Maurice's cafe, where he'd taken his breakfast for 2 decades. What would it be like walking in there, knowing he could buy the entire place if he wanted to? The old textile factory, boarded up, its broken windows like empty eyes watching the night. How many stories like that could be prevented with the right investment at the right time? At his apartment, Jack couldn't sleep. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold, he spread out several sheets of paper and began to do calculations. Numbers upon numbers, infinite possibilities unfolding before him like a deck of tarot cards, each promising a different future. $2 million, enough to save the shop, modernize it completely, and still leave a small fortune. But with money came responsibilities, decisions, inevitable changes. How to handle all of that? How to preserve the essence of what his father had built while navigating such unfamiliar waters? "What would you do, Dad?" he murmured into the apartment's silence, his eyes fixed on Sophie's drawing still pinned to the fridge. The three smiling figures seemed to watch him, as if guarding a secret he couldn't quite decipher. Inevitably, he thought of Elise and Sophie again. Could there be a connection between that snowy night and this sudden change in his fortune? The timing was too coincidental to ignore. But if there was indeed a link, why the secrecy? Why such mystery? As the night wore on, Jack's thoughts grew deeper. He remembered Elise's words on the phone. "No, he hasn't found us. We're safe, for now." Who was he? And more importantly, was this money part of something bigger he shouldn't be involved in? Then his eyes fell on the photo of his father, that confident smile suspended in time, and Jack felt a certainty stirring in his chest. Peter Morris always said opportunities often came disguised as challenges, and the key was to keep your heart open and your mind clear. If this money was somehow connected to Elise and Sophie, perhaps it was the universe giving him a chance to do even more good, to help more people. Morning found Jack still at the kitchen table, the papers now covered in notes, sketches, and plans. His coffee had long since gone cold, forming a brown ring on the tabletop, a makeshift clock marking his productive insomnia. Stepping into the shop that day, Jack sensed a shift in the town's atmosphere. Perhaps it was just his own nerves, but he could swear people were looking at him differently. News of his sudden change of fortune seemed to have spread like wildfire. "Heard you had an interesting visitor yesterday," Maurice mentioned casually when Jack stopped by for his usual breakfast. The cafe owner's tone was nonchalant, but his eyes gleamed with barely masked curiosity. "A lawyer from New York, right?" Jack stirred his coffee slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Just some legal matters to sort out," he replied vaguely, realizing for the first time how difficult it would be to maintain privacy in a town where everyone knew each other. The cafe doorbell jingled as more customers entered, and Jack felt the weight of their glances, the murmurs. In a small town like Ridgemont, word traveled faster than any modern technology. By day's end, there would probably be a dozen different versions of his sudden windfall. Back in his shop, he found himself viewing his tools with new eyes. Each worn wrench, every pair of pliers with taped handles, told a story of years of dedicated work, of honest service. But now, with the promise of millions, they symbolized a past that would have to evolve. The first catalogue of modern equipment arrived in the mail that afternoon. He had requested it weeks ago, when he'd still been hoping for a small loan to make a few modest upgrades. Now, flipping through the glossy pages, he no longer had to limit himself to dreaming. State-of-the-art hydraulic lifts, computerized diagnostic systems, specialized tools for hybrid and electric cars. Everything was now within reach. But each turned page brought new concerns. It wasn't just about buying new equipment, it was about learning to use it, training people, restructuring the entire shop layout. The modernization he'd dreamed of now loomed as a much larger challenge than simply signing checks. "We need to start small," he told himself, marking the most urgent items with a pencil. A new lift to replace the current one that groaned with each use, a basic computer diagnostic system to stop losing customers to franchise shops, and a few specialized tools for the newer car models coming in more frequently. During that meticulous review, the first proposal arrived. A parts supplier that had never bothered to work with his small shop was now offering special terms, extraordinary discounts, extended deadlines. The representative, in his tailored suit and commercial smile, acted like they had been lifelong friends. "Think of it as a mutual investment in our future, Mr. Morris," the man said, sliding a contract proposal across the desk. "Now that you're expanding your horizons." The condescending tone did not escape Jack. It was the same tone these representatives had used for years to brush him off, saying his shop was too small to justify attention. Now, lured by the scent of money, they arrived like bees to honey. Jack took the contract in his calloused hands, reading every line with the same care he used to diagnose a problematic engine. The terms looked good, too good. Hidden among the technical paragraphs were clauses about exclusivity, hidden penalties that seemed innocuous but had teeth. "I'll need some time to review this," he said, handing the document back. The representative couldn't fully hide his disappointment, clearly expecting an immediate signature. Perhaps imagining Jack's sudden wealth had dulled his common sense. The following weeks brought a steady stream of salesmen, reps, and consultants of all sorts. Each had a different proposal, a revolutionary idea, or a fail-proof plan to turn Jack's auto repair into a national powerhouse. Some arrived in luxury cars, others carrying briefcases brimming with colorful charts and rosy projections. One of them, a young business consultant with a freshly minted MBA and a carefully crafted city accent, spent 2 hours explaining how Jack could turn his shop into a national franchise. "You could have 58, maybe 100 locations in 5 years, he declared, brimming with enthusiasm for the numbers he envisioned in his own bank account. "We'd standardize everything, create a strong brand, expand into other cities." Jack listened patiently, just as he had listened to customers' problems for years, but something inside made him cautious. His father's words echoed in his memory. "An honest mechanic is worth more than a shop full of shiny tools." It was during one of those visits that the first tangible sign of change arrived at the shop. A large truck parked outside one Tuesday morning, delivering the new hydraulic lift Jack had ordered. The installation drew a small crowd of onlookers, neighbors, former clients, even a few competitors observing from a distance with inscrutable expressions. "Is it true you're turning this place into a franchise?" someone in the crowd asked, while the technicians set up the equipment. "I heard he's tearing it all down to build a brand new place," said another. "Must be a big group of investors behind this, huh?" Jack simply smiled and shook his head, focusing on the installation to ensure everything was done properly. The new lift was just the beginning. He had already ordered a computerized diagnostic system and some specialized tools. Yet he made each purchase thoughtfully, each change planned as carefully as he would approach the most delicate engine repairs. With new equipment came a new reality. He needed help. He could no longer run everything alone, especially with advanced technology requiring specialized knowledge. Hiring employees proved to be one of his most challenging decisions so far, not just for practical reasons, but for what it meant to alter his solitary routine. The first hire was Mark, his nephew, who had long insisted on working at the shop. With a degree in mechanical engineering and expertise in automotive electronics, he was essential for handling the new systems. Jack remembered Mark as a child, playing with toy cars on the shop floor while his father worked. Now, at 25, he brought not only technical skills, but also an infectious enthusiasm for the future. Next came Anthony, a young trainee from the local technical college, full of energy and eager to learn. Jack met him by chance when the boy stopped by looking for a potential internship. There was something in Anthony's eyes, a mix of determination and humility that reminded Jack of himself decades earlier. Finally, Clara, an administrative assistant recommended by an old customer, joined to handle the growing paperwork. At 45 Gs, divorced with 2 kids in college, she brought valuable life experience and a methodical knack for organizing tasks. Her practical approach soon became indispensable to the shop's daily operations. "You're changing the whole look of this street," Morris commented a few weeks later when Jack came by for his morning coffee. Indeed, the transformation was obvious. The shop's facade had been renovated, although Jack insisted on keeping the old sign, just restoring its colors. The windows were now clean and bright, allowing passers-by a glimpse of the gleaming new equipment inside. But not all changes were visible or positive. With growth came the first conflicts. Spring had finally arrived in Ridgemont, transforming the town into a mosaic of colors and scents. The trees lining the street near Jack's shop wore delicate blossoms, their branches swaying gently in the mild breeze. It was a morning like many others, or so it seemed, until the door chime sounded in a way that would change everything once again. Jack was leaning over the new diagnostic system, trying to interpret a set of particularly complex error codes on a late-model BMW, when Clara called his attention. "Mr. Morris, there are 2 customers here asking for you." Something in Clara's tone made him look up immediately. She rarely interrupted him during a diagnostic unless it was truly important. Wiping his hands on the ever-present shop rag, Jack headed for the renovated yet still cozy reception area. That was when his heart nearly stopped. Standing by the counter were 2 people he'd never forgotten, Elise and Sophie. But they were no longer the same as the night he took them in from the storm. Their transformation was remarkable. Elise wore a stylish navy blue business suit, her once disheveled dark hair now perfectly styled, framing a face that, though it still bore traces of concern, radiated a new, calm confidence. Beside her stood Sophie, now a bit taller, in a floral dress and shiny leather shoes. Her golden curls were neatly tied with a satin ribbon, and her blue eyes, once so fearful, now gleamed with childlike vitality. "Mr. Jack," Sophie reacted first, running toward him with open arms, all semblance of formality forgotten in her childish enthusiasm. Jack knelt to hug her, noticing she still carried the same cloth doll, now visibly restored but undeniably the same companion from that memorable night. "You kept my drawing," Sophie exclaimed, pointing to the wall behind the counter where the picture she'd made was now framed in a simple but elegant frame. "Of course I kept it," Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It's one of my most treasured possessions." Elise approached then, the click of her heels echoing on the new shop floor. Her perfume was subtle but sophisticated, a world away from the scent of fear and exhaustion that had surrounded her on that snowy night. "Jack," she said simply, extending her hand, but instead of shaking it, Jack pulled her into a brief, warm hug. "It's good to see you both," he said, aware of how his employees watched the scene with undisguised curiosity. "Shall we go into my office?" Jack's office was one of the few areas in the shop that retained its original simplicity, though it now featured modern computer equipment and air conditioning. The walls still bore the same old photographs, including the one of his father on opening day. "You haven't changed a thing," Elise observed, scanning the room with a nostalgic smile. "Some things don't need changing," Jack replied, indicating chairs for them. "But you look wonderful." Elise nodded, settling Sophie onto her lap. "We are. We really are. In fact, Jack, I came for 2 reasons. First, to say thank you, and second, to explain." Jack raised his hand. "You don't owe me any explanation." "I do," Elise insisted, "especially after—" She motioned vaguely toward the renovated shop, visible through the office window. "After everything." And so Elise began her story. Sophie played absently with her doll, seemingly oblivious to the adults' conversation, though occasionally glancing up with keen interest. "My real name is Elise Devereaux," she began. "I'm, or was, CEO of Devereaux Technologies, one of the largest cybersecurity software companies in the country." She paused, watching Jack's reaction. "You've probably never heard of it, but our systems protect some of the biggest corporations in America." Jack nodded slowly. The name Devereaux sounded vaguely familiar, maybe from a news article somewhere. 2 years ago, I discovered some discrepancies in our books. At first I thought they were errors, but the more I investigated, the more I realized I was dealing with something huge. Elise lowered her voice, though they were alone. "My ex-husband, Henry, who was CFO, was involved in large-scale money laundering. He was using our company as a front for questionable operations." Sophie snuggled closer to her mother, as if sensing the tension in her words. Elise automatically stroked her daughter's hair, the gesture offering comfort as much to herself as to Sophie. When I confronted Henry, he did not react well. He threatened to take Sophie from me, to use his connections to destroy me professionally, legally. He had powerful contacts, people who would do anything for money. She took a deep breath. So I did the only thing I could. I gathered all the evidence I could find, sent it to the authorities through secure channels, took Sophie, and ran. Jack recalled the night he found them, standing in the snow with only 2 small suitcases. It now made sense why their luggage seemed hastily packed and why Elise constantly looked over her shoulder. I spent months in hiding, she continued, moving from city to city, staying under assumed names in cheap motels. Henry had resources, people searching for us. That's how we ended up in Ridgemont that snowy night. Our money was almost gone. The car had broken down miles away, and Sophie had a fever. And then you appeared, Sophie interrupted suddenly, looking away from her doll. Like an angel, Mommy said. Jack felt his cheeks warm. I just did what anyone would do. No, Elise shook her head emphatically. Not everyone would open their home to 2 strangers on a winter's night. Not everyone would offer help without questions or demands. You gave us more than a roof that night, Jack. You gave us hope. She paused, taking an envelope out of her leather briefcase. The authorities finally acted on the evidence I provided. Henry is in prison, along with several of his associates. The company underwent a complete overhaul, and I resumed control 6 months ago. Jack looked at the envelope in her hands, a suspicion forming in his mind. The donation, he said simply. Elise nodded. It was the least I could do. When I took back control, one of my first acts was to find a way to repay what I owed. But it had to be discreet. Through intermediaries, there were still and still are dangerous people out there. $2 million is a lot more than just a thank you, Jack observed. It's an investment, Elise corrected. An investment in kindness, in decency, in everything you stand for. Look what you've done with it. Modernized your business, created jobs, stayed true to your principles. You proved I was right to believe in you. Sophie slipped off her mother's lap and wandered to the wall where Jack's father's photo hung. He looks nice, she said, pointing to the image. He was, Jack replied softly. He taught me everything I know about being a good mechanic and a decent person. And you've honored that teaching, Elise said. But I didn't come here just to explain and thank you. I have a proposition, Jack. She opened her briefcase again, taking out another set of documents. Devro Technologies is expanding into automotive security systems. We need trustworthy partners, repair shops that can serve as centers of excellence for installing and maintaining these systems. Jack took the documents, leafing through them. They were advanced technical specs, expansion plans, and partnership proposals. I'm not asking for an immediate answer, Elise continued. I know it's a significant decision, but I'd like you to consider it. Your shop could be our first official partner outside New York. Sophie, back at her mother's side, lifted her doll. Look, Uncle Jack, Margot is all fixed up. Mommy had her repaired, just like you repair cars. Jack smiled at the child, noticing the careful stitching on the doll, the same patches, but now reinforced with neat stitches, its dress cleaned and pressed, its yarn hair combed. Some things don't need replacing, he said. They just need care and attention to keep going. Elise smiled, understanding the metaphor. Exactly why I want you as a partner, Jack. You appreciate the value of things and of people. It's not just business. The rest of the morning passed quickly, filled with technical discussions about the proposed partnership and lighter moments. Sophie insisted on making a new drawing to hang beside the old one, this time depicting the modernized shop with its new equipment. Her art skills had improved significantly, but still retained that sweet, childlike charm. When they finally said goodbye, it was nearly lunchtime. A driver waited for them outside in a discreet but elegant car. We'll be seeing more of you, Sophie promised, giving Jack another hug. Mommy says we're moving nearby, Elise confirmed with a nod. We bought a house in the suburbs. Ridgemont seems like a good place to start anew, don't you think? Jack watched them climb into the car, Sophie waving excitedly out the window until they rounded the corner. The shop felt different now, as if their return closed a circle. Completing a story begun on that snowy night, Clara appeared at his side, holding a cup of coffee. "So it was them," she said simply. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Jack answered, taking the cup. "It was them." "And the donation," Jack smiled, sipping the coffee. "Some stories are best kept in the heart, Clara." Returning to work, Jack felt something inside him shift. The doubts that sometimes still haunted him about his decisions, about the shop's future, had dissipated. Elise and Sophie's homecoming wasn't just the end of a chapter. It confirmed he had done the right things, that kindness and integrity still had a place in the business world. Sophie's new drawing soon found its place next to the old one on the reception wall, quietly telling a story of transformation, not just of the shop, but of all the lives that had intertwined that memorable winter. And as Jack turned his attention back to the BMW awaiting diagnosis, he knew his shop had become more than just a business. It was a living testament to how a simple act of compassion could spark waves of change, reaching far beyond their origins. The future now lay before him like a newly paved road, full of possibilities but anchored by the values that had guided him all along. Somewhere along that road, he knew there would be more stories to tell, more lives to touch, more reasons to believe that sometimes the biggest miracles begin with the smallest acts of kindness. Spring continued to unfold in Ridgemont, and with it, a new story was being written at Jack's Auto Repair, a story of second chances, transformation, and above all, the enduring power of human kindness. Autumn had arrived in Ridgemont, painting the trees in shades of red and gold. Jack watched the leaves dancing in the wind through his renovated office window at the shop, his thoughts drifting back to the extraordinary events of recent months. The partnership with Devro Technologies was going well, bringing renewed energy to the business his father had built. The phone rang, pulling him from his reverie. It was Clara, her voice laced with an unusual urgency. "Mr. Morris, Ms. Devro is here. She seems upset." Jack frowned. Elise never showed up unannounced, especially during business hours. "Please, ask her to come in." When Elise entered his office, Jack immediately sensed something was wrong. She was pale, her hands clenching the handle of her leather briefcase nervously. Her eyes, typically so assured and determined, held a shadow of anxiety he hadn't seen since that snowy night. "Is Sophie all right?" was his first question, genuine concern in his voice. Yes, Elise answered quickly, taking the seat he offered. "She's at school." "Actually, Jack, I need to talk to you about something important, something I should have told you long ago." Jack watched as she opened her briefcase with trembling fingers, taking out an old, yellowed folder. The faded company logo on the cover made his heart skip a beat. Devereaux Enterprises, a name his father had often mentioned in his final years, always with a mix of bitterness and resignation. "You recognize this, don't you?" Elise asked softly, noting his reaction. Jack nodded slowly. "Your last name, I should have made the connection before. Devereaux. Like Raymond Devereaux." "My father," Elise confirmed, her voice laden with emotion. "The man who built an empire by crushing small businesses across the country." The silence that followed was heavy, steeped in decades of untold history. Jack looked at the photo of his father on the wall, recalling late nights watching him battle mounting debts and predatory contracts that strangled his dream. "It wasn't mere coincidence that I ended up at your shop that night," Elise continued, opening the folder. "I had looked for you, Jack. Your name appeared on a list I found in my father's files after his death." She started pulling out documents, old contracts, internal memos, yellowed photos. Each page revealed another layer of a dark strategy of financial manipulation and systematic destruction of small family-run businesses. "My father had a method," Elise explained, voice trembling slightly. "He identified well-established family businesses in mid-sized towns, places with tradition and the community's respect. Then, through his network of shell companies, he exerted pressure, exclusive supplier contracts, predatory bank loans, unfair competition." Jack lifted one of the documents, immediately recognizing his father's signature at the bottom. It was a loan agreement from 1995, the year everything started to unravel for the shop, terms he knew were impossible to meet. The end goal was always the same, Elise continued. Force the owners to sell at a fraction of the real value, then resell the land or convert the businesses into parts of bigger chains. I remember, Jack said quietly, his voice both firm and subdued. 1995 was the year our real trouble began. Suppliers cancelled long-standing contracts. Then the bank inexplicably raised our interest rates. My dad, he paused, controlling his emotions. My dad fought until the end, but every day brought a new battle. Elise gently touched his arm. Your father was one of the few who stood his ground, Jack. He refused to sell and kept fighting even when all odds were against him. That's why your name was specially noted in my father's files, an example of provincial stubbornness, as he used to say. Peter Morris wasn't stubborn, Jack replied with a hint of pride. He was honest. He believed a business was about more than profit. It was about people, about community. I know, Elise said sadly, and that same honesty is what I saw in you that snowy night, the same willingness to help without questions or expectations. She pulled out yet another, more recent document. When I started investigating my father's dealings after his death, I discovered the extent of the damage he caused. Dozens of families ruined, lives destroyed, dreams shattered. I decided to use my inheritance to try to make amends for some of his wrongs. Hence the donation, Jack murmured, the pieces finally falling into place. Yes, Elise confirmed. But it wasn't just charity or guilt, Jack. It was justice. Your father stood firm to the end, keeping his integrity even when everything was stacked against him, and you carried on his legacy, keeping the shop alive against all odds. She paused, taking a deep breath before going on. When I found out about my ex-husband's illegal activities at Devereaux Technologies, I realized I was following in my father's footsteps, using power and money to destroy lives. That's when I decided everything had to change, to start over. Jack stood, walking over to the window. Outside, the shop buzzed with activity. Mark advising Anthony on a complex diagnosis. Clara sorting paperwork at the counter, customers coming and going. A small universe that had nearly been destroyed by one man's greed. Why tell me this now? He finally asked, turning to face her. Because you deserve the truth, Elise answered, standing as well. And because... She hesitated. Because Sophie asked me about her grandfather yesterday, why we never talk about him. I realized I can't build a future on lies, even lies of omission. She approached the wall displaying Jack's father's photo. Raymond Devereaux died alone in his New York mansion, surrounded by wealth but no real friends. Peter Morris died surrounded by respect and love, leaving behind something that outlived him. Which one truly succeeded at life? Jack was silent for a long moment, absorbing all he had learned. So many things now made sense. The inexplicable difficulties his father had faced, the lost contracts, the doors that shut for no apparent reason. Your father may have tried to destroy this shop, he said at last, but in the end it was his daughter who saved it. There's a certain poetry in that, isn't there? Elise looked surprised, not expecting that reaction. Aren't you angry? Angry? With you? Jack shook his head. How could I be? You're not responsible for your father's actions, Elise. What matters are your own choices, your own deeds. He walked back to his desk, picking up Sophie's recent drawing, the modern, bustling shop. Look what we built from the ruins your father tried to create. Isn't that proof there's always hope for redemption? Tears rolled down Elise's cheeks. When Sophie and I arrived that night, I wasn't just fleeing Henry, I was running from a legacy of destruction. You gave us more than a roof, Jack. You gave us a chance to do better this time. Jack pulled a tissue from his drawer, offering it to her. You know what my dad always said. A broken engine can be fixed in two ways. You can replace everything that's damaged, or you can figure out why it broke and fix it the right way. I think the same goes for legacies. Elise dabbed at her eyes, a slight smile forming on her lips. That's exactly the kind of thing Sophie would say. She has that simple, childlike wisdom. Just yesterday, she told me sometimes we have to fix things even if we didn't break them. Your daughter is wiser than many adults, Jack said with a grin, recalling the first drawing she had made, now framed in the reception area. And you're doing your part to fix what you didn't break, too. There's still so much to do, Elise sighed, putting the old documents back into her briefcase. The list I found, there were dozens of other businesses, other families. And you'll help as many as you can, Jack finished. Not out of guilt or obligation, but because that's who you choose to be. A burst of children's laughter drifted through the open window, kids on their way home from school, perhaps, breaking the tension in the room and bringing them both back to the present. Sophie asked if we could come for dinner sometime, Elise mentioned, her voice lighter. She says she misses your vegetable soup. Jack smiled, remembering that first night. Sunday, he suggested. Same apartment, same soup, but this time, no secrets between us. Sunday sounds perfect, Elise agreed, heading to the door. Before she left, she turned back. Jack, thank you for everything. Nothing to thank me for, he replied simply. Just keep making a difference, the way you have been. After she left, Jack spent a long while looking at his father's photo. You were right, Dad, he murmured. In the end, honesty and kindness always win, even if it takes a generation or two. The rest of the day unfolded normally at the shop, but something had changed subtly in the air. It was as though an invisible weight had been lifted, a shadow from the past finally dispersed by the light of truth. Locking up that night, Jack thought about how life had a strange way of closing circles. The company that nearly destroyed his father's dream was now, through the late owner's daughter, helping transform it into something even bigger and better. On his desk, beside the modern computer system he now used for diagnostics, lay the old wrench his father had cherished. It reminded him that while some things had to change, others, like integrity, kindness, and a willingness to help, should always remain the same. The phone rang one last time before he left. It was Sophie, her animated voice filling the receiver. Uncle Jack, Mom said we're having dinner at your place Sunday. Can I bring Margot? She misses your soup too. Jack laughed, feeling his heart warm. Of course you can, sweetheart. Margot is always welcome here. After hanging up, he glanced once more at his father's photo. See, Dad? Sometimes the good we do comes back to us in the most unexpected ways. And so, as the sun set over Ridgemont, Jack's auto repair carried on, not merely a story of surviving adversity, but one of redemption, renewal, and the enduring possibility of fixing not just machines, but also hearts and broken legacies. One by one, the shop's lights turned off, but the light of hope that now shone there was stronger than ever. Because sometimes, the greatest victories aren't about defeating enemies, but about turning them into allies for building a better future. Somewhere, Peter Morris and Raymond Devereaux, two men who in life had represented opposite sides of a battle, might at last find peace in knowing that their children had found a better path, one of healing and reconciliation. Night fell over Ridgemont, and with it, another chapter in this extraordinary story came to a close. But as Jack well knew, every ending is merely the start of something new, and this new beginning promised to be brighter than anyone could have imagined. Maurice's cafe exuded the comforting aroma of freshly baked croissants that Sunday morning. One of the few remaining family-run businesses, the place had kept its original charm with polished wooden tables and an old-fashioned counter where Maurice himself still served his long-time patrons. Jack and Elise chose a discreet table in the corner, near a window overlooking the main street. Sophie, absorbed in her new sketchbook, occasionally lifted her eyes to watch the passing pedestrians, adding them to her artistic creations. I've spent the week reviewing old files, Elise commented, stirring her coffee pensively. Each folder tells a different story of resilience. Like your father's, there were others who refused to give in. Jack nodded, eyes roaming over the cafe's familiar decor. Maurice told me recently how his father fought to keep this place open. They had rough years, but he was determined to preserve his family's legacy. Have these curtains always been blue, Uncle Jack? Sophie asked suddenly, her blue crayon hovering over the paper. Maurice, passing by with a tray of coffee, paused to answer. Since 1962, my dear. My mother sewed them by hand when the cafe opened. They've faded a bit, but I can't bring myself to replace them. They're perfect just the way they are, Sophie declared confidently, returning to her drawing with renewed enthusiasm. Elise took out a small notebook from her purse, already filled with meticulous notes. I've found more than 30 cases here in Ridgemont alone. Small businesses, family stories, interrupted dreams. Each one deserves to be acknowledged and remembered. Like Mrs. Rosalie, Jack recalled, I still see her sometimes, tending flowers in her garden. I never knew she once had her own flower shop. On the same street as your shop, Elise confirmed. Where that department store stands now, she held out for 3 years, but in the end, her voice quivered slightly. Sophie, always perceptive of her mother's mood, reached out to touch her arm. We could plant flowers at Uncle Jack's shop, Mom, like Mrs. Rosalie's garden. The child's innocent suggestion made both adults smile. You know, Sophie, Jack said, sometimes the best ideas come from the simplest observations. Indeed, Elise agreed, jotting something in her notebook. I was thinking a lot about big gestures, financial compensation, but maybe we need to start with smaller, more personal actions. Like hugs, Sophie exclaimed, sliding her drawing to the center of the table. In it, several colorful figures embraced, with small red hearts floating around them. My teacher said hugs are like medicine for the soul. Jack studied the drawing, moved by the simple truth of its message. Your daughter has a gift for getting to the heart of things, Elise. Sometimes we get lost in complex plans when the most effective solutions are the simplest. I've been thinking, Elise said, scanning her notebook. What if we used our resources not just for financial compensation, but to rebuild the social fabric of this town? Small businesses are gathering places, hubs where the community forms naturally. Like this cafe, Jack agreed, gesturing around. Maurice's isn't just a place to get coffee. It's where people meet, share stories, keep the memory of this town alive. And the shop too, Uncle Jack, Sophie chimed in. Everybody talks there, even Anthony, who's so shy. Her observation drew laughter but also reflection. Jack thought of how his shop had evolved in recent months, not only technologically, but in its role within the community. We need to get to know our town better, he suggested. Visit other businesses, hear their stories, not just the ones that survived mine, but also families who lost everything. Elise jotted down a few quick lines. We could start an informal survey, identify not just the material needs, but the lost connections, the social networks that were broken. And make new friends, Sophie added, immersed in a fresh drawing. Their conversation flowed naturally, occasionally interrupted by Morris refilling coffee cups or a regular customer, pausing to say hello. Each interaction underscored the importance of the communal ties they were discussing. By the time they left the cafe, morning sunlight had given way to a gentler midday glow. Walking back to the shop, Jack noticed how each establishment they passed held its own story. What strikes me most, he commented, is how each small business contributes to the community in its own way. It's not just about products or services. Elise, holding Sophie's hand as she happily hopped over puddles, nodded. It's about belonging, creating spaces where people feel welcome. Back at the shop, while Sophie settled at her little desk to continue drawing, Jack and Elise resumed brainstorming. Maybe, Jack mused after a moment, we need something more structured, something that can continue beyond us, something that can grow with the town. Elise's eyes lit up with understanding. Are you thinking of a foundation? Exactly, he confirmed. A place to pool resources, expertise, and goodwill in an organized way. Sophie, apparently listening while drawing, held up her latest creation, a large, colorful house with lots of people gathered around it. Like one big family, she beamed proudly. Jack and Elise exchanged meaningful glances, once again marveling at Sophie's simple but profound insight. The day ended with promises of future meetings and many plans yet to be developed. As Jack locked up the shop, he reflected on how much his life had changed over the last months. From a solitary mechanic barely keeping his doors open, he was now part of something bigger, a potential source of real change in people's lives. The foundation would be the next step, an ambitious project requiring careful planning and full commitment. But watching Elise and Sophie leave, their hearts brimming with hope and resolve, Jack knew they were on the right track. After all, as his father always said, the greatest journeys start with a single step taken in good company. And now, united by a common purpose, they were ready to take that step together. The old textile factory had been completely transformed. Its once crumbling walls now sported a fresh coat of paint in soft tones. The shattered windows had been replaced with modern glass panes that let natural light flood the interior. The place that once symbolized Ridgemont's industrial decline was about to assume a new meaning. Jack adjusted his tie, an item he rarely wore, as he observed the final preparations for the launch of the Maurice Devereux Foundation. The large ground floor hall was set up for the ceremony, with chairs arranged in a semicircle and a small improvised stage. On the walls, black and white photographs narrated the town's history, including a special one of Peter Morris standing in front of his newly opened shop. "Nervous?" Elise asked, approaching quietly. She held a folder with the foundation's official documents, the result of months of meticulous planning. "A bit," Jack admitted with a grin. "I've never been great at speeches. I prefer the sound of engines to the sound of my own voice on a mic." "Mom!" Sophie dashed over, her new dress fluttering around her. "Mrs. Rosalie is here." And she brought flowers for the stage. Sure enough, the former florist entered the hall carrying gorgeous arrangements of locally grown flowers. Her eyes sparkled with a joy Jack hadn't seen in years. She'd been among the first to engage with the foundation, contributing not only her floral expertise, but also her life experience. "This place," she commented as she arranged the flowers, "was where I used to source the finest linens for my shop. Who would have thought I'd return here, after so many years, for such a beautiful new start?" Jack's Auto Repair, now serving as the foundation's model training center, had become a symbol of the possible transformations. Young apprentices not only learned mechanical skills, but also studied ethical business principles and social responsibility. Anthony, Jack's first trainee, now coordinated the training program. "Uncle Jack," Sophie called, tugging at his sleeve. "Can I show my special project during the presentation?" Sophie's special project was a large mural she'd created depicting all the local small businesses the foundation aimed to support. Each drawing told a story: the Moreau Bakery, Maurice's Cafe, Mrs. Rosalie's old flower shop, and of course Jack's Auto Repair. "Of course you can, sweetheart," Jack replied, ruffling her hair. "Honestly, your mural says more about our mission than any speech I could give." Guests began arriving, local shop owners, both old and new, families who had lost their businesses in past decades, young entrepreneurs dreaming of starting something fresh. Each face bore a story. Each handshake carried hope. Clara, who'd become indispensable to the foundation's organization, welcomed attendees with her usual efficiency. Mark moved among the groups, explaining the training and mentoring programs that would be offered. "It's time," Elise noted softly, touching Jack's arm. Stepping onto the small stage, Jack felt the weight of the moment. Scanning the crowd, he recognized familiar faces and new ones. There was Maurice, who had fought so hard to keep his cafe alive; Mrs. Rosalie, whose flowers now graced the space; Sophie, sitting in the front row, proudly clutching her mural. "When my father opened Jack's Auto Repair," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "he taught me that a business isn't just about profit. It's about people, community, and making a difference in others' lives." He paused, his gaze landing on his father's photograph. "Over the years, our town has seen many family businesses close down, many dreams fade. But it has also seen resilience, courage, and above all, hope. The Maurice Devereux Foundation is born today not just as a source of financial support, but as a hub for community renewal, a place where past stories can inspire new beginnings, where experience and innovation come together for a brighter future. Elise joined him on stage, her presence a silent reassurance. "When I arrived in Ridgemont on a snowy night," she continued, "I found more than shelter. I discovered a lesson in kindness, in how one simple act of generosity can unleash a wave of transformation." Overcome with excitement, Sophie ran up to the stage with her mural. "Look," she exclaimed, holding it up high. "All these people are our family now, everyone together doing good things." The child's spontaneity drew warm smiles and applause. Her innocence and enthusiasm perfectly captured the spirit of what they were trying to achieve. "The foundation will have 3 main pillars," Jack resumed, now more relaxed. "Financial and technical support for small businesses, training and mentorship programs, and community revitalization projects. Most importantly, will be a space for connection, sharing, and rebuilding bonds." When the official ceremony ended, the attendees mingled throughout the renovated space, exchanging stories and hopes for the future. Jack found a quiet moment by the window, watching the town in the late afternoon sun. No longer a place of lost opportunities, but a fertile field for new beginnings. "What are you thinking about?" Elise asked, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. "How life twists in unexpected ways," he answered, accepting a glass. "Who'd have thought that snowy night would bring us here?" Sophie appeared between them, her mural now hanging on one of the main walls. "My teacher said sometimes we have to get lost to find the right path." Jack and Elise exchanged glances over Sophie's head. Once again, the simple wisdom of a child perfectly summed up their journey. The sun began to set over Ridgemont, its last golden rays streaming through the factory's new windows. A new chapter was unfolding, not just for Jack, Elise, and Sophie, but for an entire community rediscovering the importance of unity, perseverance, and kindness. The Maurice Devereaux Foundation was more than an economic revitalization project. It was a living testament to how goodness could bloom in the least likely circumstances, how redemption could span generations, and how a single act of compassion could indeed transform the world.